You just can't beat a good superboss. But even though they're now pretty commonplace amongst role-playing games, there to serve as milestones for progress and a rite of passage, that wasn't always the case. In Final Fantasy terms, it wasn't until the 5th game that the first codified superboss appeared, with prior games only featuring pseudo-superbosses like Warmech and the Iron Giant. Ever since then, however, the developers at Square, and subsequently Square Enix, have been keen to introduce new, devilish fiends that are there to smite unsuspecting or unprepared players. And throughout this video, we're going to run through some of the absolute worst, with our usual caveat of only having one superboss per game. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, my name is Daryl, and this is an extensive collection of superbosses that, unless you were incredibly well prepared for, you definitely didn't beat first time. And the first one is Kickstarter. Yes, crowdfunding can often be a pretty big challenge to overcome. According to Kickstarter's own research, only 42.2% of projects ever reach their funding goal. That means technically, we did beat the challenge by successfully crowdfunding our previous book. But that was only because we had an incredible community there to support us. And that community has stepped up again, as our latest project, an extensive book about Final Fantasy summons called The Guardians of the Crystal, has not only hit its funding goal, but has smashed it. We are now working towards stretch goals that are designed to enhance the quality of the book for all physical backers. So if you've been holding off, or if this is the first time you're hearing about the project, please check out the link in the description below to find out more. Now, let's get on to some real superbosses. Following the introduction of weapons as superbosses in Final Fantasy VII, the team working on Final Fantasy VIII decided to pay tribute to what was largely their own creation by introducing two new weapons called Ultima and Omega. Ultima was found at the Deep Sea Research Center and offered up a decent challenge once you'd reached the depths. But Omega, who lay in wait within Ultimecia's castle, took things to a whole new level, with punishing attacks that were unlike anything else seen in the game. Those who wanted to test themselves first, though, had to solve a mini-puzzle that involved the bell outside of the art gallery. Upon ringing the bell, a mega weapon appeared at the chapel within the castle, and by switching teams, it was possible to approach a mega weapon before the timer ran out. The fight itself, though, could be pretty intense, as expected. Omega had 1.16 million HP, and could inflict some serious pain due to its rather extensive array of abilities. But a mega weapon did have a weakness: its predictable nature. Outside of its standard attacks, a mega weapon cycled through a predetermined set of moves that were designed to be extremely awkward. But if you knew what was coming, it was possible to suitably prepare. For example, prior to a mega weapon's three strongest attacks, Megiddo Flame, Terror Break, and Light Pillar, it always used a non-elemental AoE attack that was designed to weaken the party in preparation for the next step. Megiddo Flame, for example, did 9,998 damage, so unless you healed up following Meteor, a game over screen was imminent. Likewise, Terror Break, which did 16 hits of at least 4,000 damage each spread across the entire party, served as a follow-up to Gravijar, which reduced party HP by 75%. Again, if you didn't heal up, and also didn't either have the Protect status or the Defend command utilised, another game over was very likely. But that's what made a mega weapon so challenging. One wrong move could easily signal the end. But there were some good antidotes. Mega Elixirs were extremely useful for recovering before the three aforementioned attacks, assuming you had enough party members still alive to make use of them and enough stock. Likewise, using a hero drink or holy war could ease the pressure, as these items made either a single character or the entire party invincible for a specific period of time. If successful, the party was then granted the Proof of Omega, a key item that, prior to the advent of trophies and achievements, allowed players to show off their accomplishment to their friends. Absolute Virtue was added into Final Fantasy XI alongside the Lemuria Notorious Monster system back in 2005 as part of an update to Chains of Promathia. And at the time, the fight was tough. Very tough. But that's assuming you could even get to the point of being able to actually fight against Absolute Virtue, as doing so required players to navigate through the minefield of defeating the various jailers and hoping they dropped the necessary triggers. If that was achieved, what made Absolute Virtue so challenging, in its initial incarnation at least, was the sheer volume of things it could call upon. Using Dragoon as its base job, Absolute Virtue was able to use the abilities related to that job, but it could also use select 2-hour abilities for all the other jobs too, such as Benediction, which was the White Mage's special job ability that could restore a significant amount of HP. On top of all of this, Absolute Virtue also had a rather hefty auto regen, and when its HP was reduced by certain amounts, it got progressively stronger. Needless to say, when all these elements were combined, it made for a very tough fight, and there were numerous reports of Linkshell spending huge sessions, often lasting days, attempting to figure out a strategy. Unfortunately, the only way they could achieve this was through exploits. And as if to rub salt in the wound, whenever anyone found an exploit, the developers released a patch that made the strategy obsolete. 3 years after Absolute Virtue was added to the game, due to nobody being able to legitimately defeat the creature, the development team then released a tutorial to help give hints. But as a further irony, they released a patch not long after that stopped people from being able to use those strategies. As you might expect, it led to lots of angst amongst the community, and this eventually came to a head when the media got hold of just how ridiculous the boss fights were in Final Fantasy XI. In 2008, this led to Absolute Virtue being toned down, but even then, it was still tough. And it was only when the game's level cap was increased from 75 to 99 that victory in this battle became much more achievable. With Yasumi Matsuno having to leave his role as the director of Final Fantasy XII due to poor health, the development team decided to pay tribute to their former leader. And to do so, they created a hunt called Farewell to a Legend, where players needed to defeat an ultimate elite mark called Yizmat. To gain access to the hunt, players needed to have defeated every rank 7 mark with the exception of the Shadowseer. But they also needed to have defeated the Hellworm, a rather troublesome optional boss that acted as something of an audition for what was to come. Once done, Yizmat then appeared in the Colosseum at the Ridorana Cataract, and when venturing there, players found that this superboss was not for the faint of heart. What made Yizmat so challenging, in the original game at least, was the endurance required to win, and that was because the PlayStation 2 version had a hard damage cap of 9,999, and Yizmat had over 50 million hit points. To make matters worse, once Yizmat dropped below 50% of its health, the maximum damage players could deal in a single action reduced down to 6,999. That meant the fight could take literal hours. But the developers did at least give players the chance to leave, take a break and restock, as Yizmat's health wouldn't regenerate unless it cast regen before the party left. In terms of the battle itself, Yizmat's Rake ability had a 5% chance for inflicting instant death with every hit, and the lower its health, the more combo attacks it performed, reaching 12 hit combos within its final stage. Alongside this, it had a complementary move called Death Strike that also cast instant death, although this could be somewhat mitigated by using Shell. Basically, Yizmat was going to kill party members during the fight a lot, and it was just about how players dealt with that while managing to keep the pressure on Yizmat despite the intensity of the fight increasing as it reached its climax. Compared to many other iterations in the Final Fantasy franchise, Final Fantasy IX was rather unique in that its difficulty wasn't all about big numbers. Whereas many other final bosses or superbosses like the aforementioned Omega Weapon and Yizmat had hit points that were well in the millions, the boss with the most hit points in Final Fantasy IX was actually Quail, who only had 65,535. Ozma, the most taxing and troublesome boss in the game, only had 55,535, which, if you were hitting the hard damage cap, meant you could technically win in just 6 actions. But that's a very hypothetical situation. To gain access to Ozma, players needed to play Chocobo Hot and Cold to the point where they gained access to the Chocobo's Air Garden. Here, players could venture to a place called the Eidolon Cave, which is where Ozma resided. And due to Ozma's low health, this fight was all about preparation. You see, Ozma was rather astute and changed its behaviour in the fight depending on party setup. For example, if the party was set up to absorb or nullify elemental attacks or status effects, Ozma wouldn't waste turns casting those spells in its repertoire. Contrary to what players thought, this then made the fight harder, as it increased the probability that Ozma would use Meteor, its devastating attack that could cause an instant game over. Outside of this horrible spell, Ozma also had the unfair advantage of operating outside of the known constraints of the ATB system. Irrespective of its active time state, any action taken by the party caused Ozma to instantly receive a turn. This made it extremely difficult to have more than one turn in a row before Ozma performed an action of its own. The trick was to therefore hold off on performing actions until Ozma was in the middle of performing its own action. But Ozma could also perform counterattacks, and one of its counters was to cast Curaga on itself. So yes, while it's definitely possible to defeat Ozma in just 6 actions, with the way Ozma is configured, it's just not that simple. And despite only having just over 55,000 HP, this fight could still last well over 10 minutes on a successful run. Even though Ruby Weapon was not part of the original Superboss lineup when Final Fantasy VII launched in Japan, having been cut out due to time constraints, it was added back in for the North American release. For much of the game though, Ruby Weapon lay dormant. But once Ultimate Weapon had been defeated as part of the story, it rose up out of the small desert in the Gold Saucer area, provoking players with its monstrous form and waiting to snare them like a Venus flytrap. For anyone brave enough to take up the challenge, Ruby Weapon often proved to be stiff competition. The encounter, for example, always started as a back attack. This meant players were immediately on the back foot, as it meant starting the encounter with no ATB gauge and Ruby Weapon being given a head start and an immediate damage boost. Ruby Weapon also used its tentacles to prevent any kind of escape should the player realise they were in a bit too deep. If the initial phase was survived, the party was then given the chance to go on the offensive, but would quickly find themselves face to face with an enemy that had defensive stats so high that most attacks that didn't ignore defense or have a fixed damage output were nullified. Ruby also responded to any such actions with offensive actions of its own in the form of Ruby Ray, Ruby Flame, and numerous gravity-based attacks. These were troublesome, but perhaps the most surprising aspect of Ruby was that it just wouldn't fight fair. If you were in a situation where you could survive and could even start to deal some damage, Ruby Weapon tried to make the playing field uneven by using the Whirl Sand ability. This removed one party member from the encounter and could be used twice to reduce the party of 3 down to a party of 1. And if you were going into this fight unprepared, then that would immediately raise the stakes and the difficulty. Back in the day, it meant defeating Ruby was a pretty big achievement, especially if unprepared. And even though that does remain today, there is just so much information online that Ruby Weapon doesn't quite pose the same challenge as it once did. The original Final Fantasy did not feature an official superboss. Instead, Warmech was there as a pseudo-superboss, waiting to punish players who were unfortunate enough to encounter it in the Flying Fortress. Things changed though. And when the original Final Fantasy started to get remade, the developers opted to start including new challenges. And one of them was Chronodia. Perhaps due to its featuring as part of the game's 20th anniversary celebration, Chronodia was unlike any superboss ever seen before in the franchise. And this related to the challenge itself, but also the path players needed to traverse to even reach the encounter. When making their way through a new bonus dungeon called the Labyrinth of Time, players needed to solve numerous puzzles. And a success in these puzzles then changed the conclusion of the dungeon and Chronodia itself. And this was because players could fight different variations of Chronodia. In total, due to the volume of puzzles and the amount of combinations that arose based on the completion status, there were 8 different iterations of Chronodia, and each one was unique. But it was the 8th variant, which could only be fought if all puzzles were complete, which was the most devilish. Alongside having the highest HP and attributes of all the variants, this iteration of Chronodia had access to the moves of all the 4 fiends, as well as some of those associated with Chaos itself. And it meant this fight was absolutely not a cakewalk. The unending coil of Bahamut was introduced in patch 4.11 of Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. And as the first ultimate raid, it served as a real test of discipline and teamwork. The battle was split into 5 distinct phases, and as you'd expect, they got progressively harder. This started with individual fights against Twintania and Nail Deastanas, both of which were challenging in their own right. But it was Phase 3 where things started to get a bit more serious, owing to the arrival of Bahamut Prime. During this phase, Bahamut Prime could cast Giga Flare multiple times. But the main challenge arose from its use of an ability called Grand Octet, which summoned 5 additional dragons to rain down some serious pain. While trying to avoid wiping, players also needed to continue putting pressure on Bahamut Prime. And this was because if Bahamut Prime's health wasn't below 60% following the completion of Grand Octet, then the fight was essentially lost when going into the 5th and final phase. This phase saw the arrival of Golden Bahamut, and the challenge was that by not reducing Bahamut Prime's health by far enough, Golden Bahamut was given a significant damage buff, and this made the encounter almost impossible to win. Golden Bahamut also needed to be defeated before it completed 5 sequences of its ability set, as this led to Enragement, which also made the encounter nearly impossible to complete. It was therefore very essential to make sure the team was well oiled and prepared to ensure any hope of success. Omega was one of the first superbosses in the franchise, appearing alongside Shinryu in Final Fantasy V. It has long been debated as to which of these two is actually harder, but for this list we've decided to go with Omega, and that's down to the strategies that have to be employed to achieve victory. You see, there are specific strategies that can be implemented against Shinryu that mean it's possible to achieve victory at a much lower level than against Omega. They just take some setup. Omega, though, isn't quite as simple to figure out. The encounter itself seems somewhat unassuming on face value, as Omega was found inside the interdimensional rift just wandering around the map directly outside of a save point. This lulled curious players into a false sense of security, and it must be responsible for so many wipes. For starters, any attack that dealt damage to Omega was countered by 2 actions. The first could be either Rocket Punch, which dealt half the character's current HP and damage and inflict Confuse, or Mustard Bomb, a very high damage dealing move that inflicted sap. This was then followed by either another Rocket Punch or Encircle, an ability that erased a party member from the battle. Omega could of course also perform actions on its own turns, and these included the iconic Wave Cannon and Delta Attack. The only saving grace was that Omega's search ability highlighted who it was going to focus on in the next turn, and it meant if you did go in with a good strategy and got lucky with the counters, then the fight could be done pretty quick. But that didn't make it any less difficult, as due to how Omega reacted to everything you did, there was always just a chance that it wouldn't be your time to win, no matter how prepared you were. Penance did not appear in the original version of Final Fantasy X that was released in Japan and North America. Instead, it debuted in Final Fantasy X International, which then became the default version of the game for Europeans. To gain access to this new devilish foe, players first had to defeat all of the new Dark Aeons, superbosses in their own right that posed a serious challenge. Once completed, Penance appeared above the Calm Lands. Now the caveat here is that Penance and the Dark Aeons could be defeated using Zamato for instant victory. But for those who consider themselves purists, they're in for a pretty serious fight. Clocking in with 12 million HP and 2 arms with 500,000 HP each that acted independently, Penance had a lot of staying power, and this was exacerbated as its right arm could heal for 100k per turn. The other, rather troublesome aspect was Judgment Day, Penance's ultimate ability that it performed after being hit for damage 19 times, assuming both of its arms were still active. This ability dealt 99,999 damage to all party members, instantly killing every single one of them. Auto life was therefore the saving grace here, but you'd then have to promptly recover to survive Penance's next assault. The main strategy therefore focuses around diminishing the impact of the arms, and if executed correctly, they should never get a turn. It's still not a walk in the park though, as Penance could use Obliteration to deal up to 23,000 damage to the entire party, and there was also the second form. This saw Penance start to use an ability called Immolation, which, if not kept in check, could quickly kill off party members due to its armor break status. Needless to say, defeating Penance requires a lot of patience and concentration. Even though Final Fantasy 1 and 2 did feature pseudo-superbosses, Final Fantasy V was when they became officially subcategorized within the ever-expanding Final Fantasy bestiary, as we discussed when talking about Omega. From then on, superbosses became more and more common, And as the earlier Final Fantasy games started to get re-released, the developers who were placed in charge opted to create additional challenges. We've already spoken, for example, about Chronodia, but another great example comes from the Iron Giant that appeared in the Final Fantasy III remake. As a generic enemy, the Iron Giant had featured in almost every single game up until the release of the 3 remake. But even though many of them were tough encounters, including its powerful appearance as a pseudo-superboss in Final Fantasy II, none of them came close to the horrifying strength it displayed in this particular iteration. The Iron Giant could be found in an optional dungeon that was aptly named the Iron Giant's Cave, and access was granted after the player had received all 4 letters from the 4 old men and Prince Arlus. Deep inside the dungeon, players would then find yellow, green and red dragons, but the real challenge was found much deeper, and even players who thought they were well prepared could easily come unstuck. At the start of the fight, the Iron Giant had 199,999 HP, a considerable increase when compared to any other boss in the game. And to make matters worse, the Iron Giant could attack 4 times per turn, with its normal attacks inflicting numerous status effects. There were also 2 phases. During the first half of the fight, the Iron Giant used normal attacks to strike a single target and Meteor to attack a random assortment. After falling below 65% of its starting HP though, the Iron Giant would continue to use normal attacks, but instead of using Meteor, it changed to using Swipe, a devastating move that would typically deal around 4,000 damage to every party member. It made the fight very, very tough, and not many have taken a swipe at the Iron Giant and survived. One of the most important elements of Final Fantasy XI's ever-evolving ecosystem was notorious monsters. Unlike standard monsters found in the field, or those related to either the main scenario or optional quests, notorious monsters were planned to be very tough and very rare. As Final Fantasy XI built out, so too did the quality of the notorious monsters and the challenge they offered, and we've already spoken about Absolute Virtue, which came in the Chains of Promathia expansion. But following the game's first expansion, Rise of the Zealot, that notion was starting to really become codified. And that was in part due to the Sky Notorious monsters, but also the Archangels, which were on a whole other level. As the Rise of the Zealot questline reached its conclusion, players were required to make their way to the Ruan Gardens. Here, players could square off against enemies known as the Archangels, who were dark manifestations of the player character races. In the traditional sense, each of these rather difficult enemies was meant to be faced one after another by a full party of 6. And to make this easier, they could be encountered in any order. But those who were up for a challenge could take on an alternate version of the quest called Divine Might. Instead of facing each boss back to back, Divine Might challenged players to face all 5 Archangels at the same time. What made this option even more perilous was that each race adopted a classic job and sub-job combination, and they could take full advantage of the toolkits available. And this included the use of what at the time were known as 2-hour abilities. Some of them, such as the Hume Archangel, could even use their 2-hour ability whenever they wanted. In the worst case scenario, it meant the numerous Archangels could use their 2-hour abilities all at the same time. And as some of them could even summon pets, this meant the fight could get rather complicated as numerous enemies needed to be juggled. To make matters worse, as this was an optional quest as opposed to a mission, deaths resulted in experience loss. So a well-organised alliance was therefore recommended before tackling this challenge, but even then, it wasn't a guarantee. Next on the list is Almighty Shinra from Final Fantasy X-2. This particular superboss was not included within the base version of the game, which is a common theme we've tackled so far. Just like Penance, it instead arrived as part of Final Fantasy X-2 International and Last Mission, and it has since made an appearance in Western versions via the HD remasters. Unlike some of the original superbosses like Chak and Tremor, who could be found within the optional Via Infinito dungeon, Almighty Shinra was part of the Fiend Arena, and unlocking the opportunity to even square off against Almighty Shinra was quite complicated in itself, as it required players to gain access to the Fiend World Cup. This required numerous enemies to be captured and transformed, something that built up all the way to Ultima Weapon and Omega Weapon. Should the Fiend Tale for Omega Weapon then be completed, The Fiend World Cup changed into the almighty Shinra Cup, where Shinra, who had been transformed after absorbing the Fireflies from Omega Weapon, waited as the final challenge. And what a challenge. Right at the start of the fight, Shinra unleashed Cleone, an ability that hit 10 times against random characters for significant damage. Afterwards, it then cycled through using physical attacks, alongside Ultima and Full Break, while utilising the haste status effect for its own benefit. After dropping down to less than 25% HP, Almighty Shinra then used a move called Final Impact. This hit random characters 14 times, with each hit dealing damage equal to 12.5% of the target's maximum HP and MP. It made Almighty Shinra rather harsh, and to survive even the initial move required very high level characters, each with the right equipment and dress spheres set up. Another significant challenge can be found in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. After appearing towards the end of the game, Minerva added an extra layer of complexity to the already quite complicated story of the Final Fantasy VII compilation. But outside of a small cameo in that story, Minerva appeared as an incredibly hard superboss. To gain the right to square off against Minerva though, players first needed to undertake and complete all of the 9th wave of missions that related to the Great Cave of Wonders. The mission focused around Minerva though was mission 966 called the Reigning Deity, and after venturing down to the bottom of the Great Cavern of Wonders, Minerva was found waiting. Compared to many of the other bosses faced throughout Crisis Core, Minerva represented a significant hike up in difficulty. Not only did she have 10 million HP and just shy of 1 million MP, her special move, Judgment Arrow, dealt huge amounts of damage, while also taking away MP, AP and removing all buffs, including re-raise. Minerva also had a move called Krista. This magical attack dealt high damage, and it was impossible to dodge without perfect timing or the use of the dash materia. There are, of course, numerous strategies available for trying to defeat Minerva, and one of them requires having at least 60 million gil to be spent on gil toss that can be used to whittle down our HP while trying to survive the relentless assault. For those who did not find the fight challenging enough though, there was a tougher version which could be encountered when playing on hard mode. As an entire saga, Final Fantasy XIII features a huge array of superbosses, and thanks to the introduction of difficulty settings and New Game Plus, even some of the normal bosses, such as Benevelza, represent a real challenge. But when comparing them all, Chaos Aeronite stands alone. Aeronite could be found from Day 7 onwards in the Giant Sandbox, and its location within that area was dependent on the time of day. When playing on normal difficulty, Aeronite started with 11 million HP, a significant increase on many other bosses. Benevelza, for example, only had 600,000. Due to this high base, players needed to rely on staggering Aeronite to deal any kind of real damage. But one stagger level was not enough, as Aeronite needed to be staggered 4 times before the damage dealing could commence. What made this challenging was that there was approximately 3 minutes allotted to achieve each level of stagger, and if, for whatever reason, a stagger didn't happen within the allotted time, Aeronite used its Fed Up ability to flee the battle before fully healing itself. It made the fight quite complicated, as outside of attempting to increase its stagger quickly enough to allow the fight to continue, staying alive was also a very real concern. In the initial instance, Aeronite used abilities such as Black Hole to suck lightning in before dealing damage via its Roar and Dragon Breath attack, but after each stagger, its attack patterns would change. It started using spells that had longer durations with higher potencies, and by the 3rd stagger, Aeronite would start using an ability called Hellflare that ignored resistances to deal massive damage. The only real way to survive was just to have a boatload of HP or perfectly execute a guard. Should a successful strategy be executed though, then players could sleep soundly, knowing they'd slain a real menace. But defeating Aeronite on normal was only just the start, as there was also Chaos Aeronite, which featured boosted attributes, and then there's also hard mode iterations of Aeronite and Chaos Aeronite, the latter of which has 57 million HP. That then brings us on to the Judge Magisters in Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age. Throughout the main story of Final Fantasy XII, the Judge Magisters represented a persistent and imposing figure. Used to handle sensitive and important missions, they appeared at prominent points throughout the story, and when fought, they were formidable. Owing to the fact that they were only ever fought in isolation though, whenever the judges were encountered, they were ultimately defeated by the party. But thanks to the addition of Trial Mode in Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, which then carried over to the Zodiac Age, they could also be fought as a unit of 5. This appeared as the 100th and final trial, right after defeating Yzmat and Omega Mark XII, and its designation was apt, as the fight represented by far the biggest challenge in the game. Each judge had a specific role to play, much like in the main campaign. Judge Bergen was very aggressive and charged forward without much thought for personal safety, and he was supported in this endeavour by Judge Gabranth. But unlike Bergen, who was susceptible to negative status effects such as sleep, slow and stop, Gabranth was not. Judge Drace, Geese and Zargobath were then much more focused on magic. Drace would attempt to support her allies by buffing them with Protectgar, Shelgar and Hastegar, and if this was allowed to succeed, would then turn offensive with her spellcasting. Geese's primary focus was on enfeebling the party by removing their positive status effects and supplementing with negative ones. And Zargobath was focused on additional buffs for his own team, such as bravery. As a unit, it meant they were horrible, and the only chance of success was to adopt a solid plan, lay the foundations from the beginning, and never lose the advantage. That, however, is easier said than done, and it was only once the judges started to fall that the fight starts to become easier. But if you were successful in defeating the Judge Magisters, and felt like the challenge was not big enough, then you could always try to defeat them on weak mode. This was adjusted in the Zodiac Age to make it not quite as punishing, but weak mode is not a walk in the park, irrespective of which version of the game is being played. Feral Chaos was an intriguing superboss, as unlike many others we've featured, it could be encountered multiple times. And the first instance was right at the start of a brand new playthrough of Dissidia Duodecim. When asked about their proficiency with the game, should the player respond by saying they're a master at Dissidia, the game would then thrust them into a fight against Feral Chaos, despite only having access to lightning at level 1 with no equipment. The idea was to make the fight nearly impossible to win, a punishment for their hubris. But it was technically possible to win if the player was indeed a master. After this, Feral Chaos could be encountered through numerous means, twice as part of the Confessions of the Creator, at the end of arcade modes Time Attack, Crystal Course, and in the Labyrinth. None of these encounters were easy, and in many the odds were heavily stacked in Feral Chaos' favour. Outside of its regular moveset, it featured ridiculous amounts of health or used accessories to increase its attack and defense by up to 400%. Now, Final Fantasy X-2 featured numerous horrible bosses, and we've already spoken about Almighty Shinra on this list. This then comes to our second caveat. We have technically featured 2 Final Fantasy XI superbosses from different expansions, and Final Fantasy X-2 and X-2 International are technically different games. So that means we can also talk about Tremor. Serving as a haunting reference back to the original game, where he featured as Seymour Guado's faithful servant, in X-2, Tremor appeared at the bottom of Via Infinito. And there were 2 aspects that made this fight horrible. The first was that after players had defeated Paragon, a difficult fight in itself, they were forced to face Tremor without being given the fight to recover between the 2 encounters. The second was that Tremor was even tougher than Paragon. Almost every major attribute of Tremor's was maxed out at 255, and it also had just shy of 1 million HP. This all meant Tremor packed a real punch and negated a lot of the damage thrown its way. Tremor was also tricky because many of its attacks had limited cooldowns and landed status effects such as Poison and Stop. They were also used alongside Meteor, a brutal ability that struck random targets 12 times for 12.5% of the target's maximum HP, and this meant Tremor could ignore the natural turn-based cadence, attacking almost at will. Within the original game, it meant players often needed to rely on cheeky strategies such as the power of Catnip, which, when combined with Trigger Happy, could deal around 150,000 HP of damage. They just needed to keep on reviving their gunner non-stop to maintain that damage output. However, within the international and subsequent HD versions, the strategy was rendered obsolete. Players now have to instead grind Tremor down the old-fashioned way, using defensive strategies to stay alive and dealing damage whenever possible. With Tremor checked off the list, it's time to take a step back and focus on another superboss that appeared at the bottom of another dungeon. Final Fantasy Tactics featured a gritty narrative and a compelling turn-based gameplay system. But for players that wanted more, there was plenty of optional content, including Midlight Steam. This optional dungeon became accessible after completing the battles in Mulond, and it consisted of 10 independent levels of increasing difficulty. Everything then culminated with a fight against Elidibus, who, after using the 13th Orosite, transformed into the Lucavi known as Serpentarius. What made this encounter challenging, outside of having to fight through all the previous floors to even get there, was that Elidibus was not alone. Numerous Reavers joined the battle, serving as a distraction, and they needed to be dealt with before tackling Elidibus to make the encounter much more manageable. Elidibus also wielded Zodiark, the most powerful summonable entity in the game. This could deal incredible damage, and if not prepared, it could lead to quite a few wipes through either the damage or the low chance of instant death that came alongside Darkening Cloud. The positive was that if the party had a summoner, they could at least try to learn Zodiark, assuming they were able to survive. Shinryu alongside Omega, as we've discussed, were the two original superbosses, and they struck fear into the hearts and minds of anyone who played Final Fantasy V, but for different reasons. For example, Omega was visible on the map while Shinryu was hiding in a chest. And whereas Omega had some horrible counters, punishing players who thought they could get in with some early damage, Shinryu started the encounter with a preemptive strike that often led to an immediate wipe. Similar notions were then carried forward for their upgraded versions, which featured in Final Fantasy V Advance. But because we featured Omega much earlier, this time we're going to shine a light on Neo Shinryu. Just like its predecessor, Neo Shinryu was found once again hiding inside a chest that contained a strong weapon, except this time it was inside the Sealed Temple, and the weapon was Ultima Weapon. The main challenge around this encounter was again Shinryu's deception. Except instead of using a sucker punch, it now changed states. Neo Shinryu had a very strong offensive and defensive capabilities and two states, invulnerable and vulnerable. The challenge was that you never really knew which state was up, and the only way to figure it out was to attack and see what happened. When dropped down to a specific HP milestone, Neo Shinryu also used Mute and switched up his attack patterns to be physical only. This then made the fight even more complicated. And that still wasn't the end. Even if you did win, Neo Shinryu cast Giga Flare and Meteor as final throws of the dice. The enhanced advanced port of Final Fantasy IV also came with some new entries in the Superboss roster, but amongst them, Brachiorydos was arguably the most challenging. Found near the bottom of the Lunar Ruins, Brachiorydos ended up being quite devilish. Whereas many of its contemporaries attempted to overwhelm the party with massive HP pools or horrible abilities, what made Brachiorydos very tough, on paper at least, was its adaptive phases. But these weren't like the ones we just touched on with Neo Shinryu. After starting out with its main phase, Brachiorydos performed a set list of abilities that skewed towards physical damage before starting to count down to Mega Flare. Should the party then attack Brachiorydos during the countdown, its phase shifted to a more magical stance. And if the Mega Flare countdown was initiated in this phase, further attacks resulted in Brachiorydos countering with the powerful Object 199 ability. If the party opted to have Brachiorydos stay outside of its magical phase and its HP then fell below 100,000, the final phase then came to the fore. And this placed more emphasis on enfeebling magic, including Slow, Toad, Confuse and Berserk. There was, however, a weakness. Should the party have obtained Kane's Able Lance prior to the encounter, they could randomly cast Tornado, which bypassed resistances and crumbled Brachiorydos. That then brings us on to the final superboss within this list, which is also one of the most recent additions. Yes, we're talking about Weiss from Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. In the original version of the game, the Pride and Joy prototype was billed as a superboss, but many felt it was much easier than squaring off against Bahamut in the round before due to its horrible combination with Ifrit. Following the release of Intergrade though, a new superboss was added into the base game, and it upped the ante in considerable fashion. Weiss was only accessible after completing episode Intermission. Players then needed to head back to the Shinra Combat Simulator within the main game during Chapter 17 on Hard Mode. And when doing so, a new mission against Weiss was available. What made the encounter so tough was a combination of things. First, the game hindered the effectiveness of the Gotterdammerung. Weiss was also near impossible to damage unless staggered, something that was made even more complicated by Weiss's ability to reduce his own stagger gauge by using an ability called Rejuvenation. Vice also had a wide assortment of offensive abilities, each of which was unblockable. And he also had numerous forms, which increased the volume of abilities players had to learn how to avoid. With Vice also being very aggressive, very fast, and having unorthodox timing points on these aforementioned attacks, learning how to handle these various moves and phases could take a considerable amount of time. Still, even though Vice may have seemed impossible to defeat, it is very much possible. And according to stats around PlayStation trophies, it's a feat that has been achieved by approximately 1.9% of those who ended up purchasing Intermission. But with that, we've reached the end of this exploration into superbosses you definitely didn't beat the first time around. For this video, we've tried a similar format to our elongated Final Fantasy X facts video last year, which everyone seemed to vibe with. So if you enjoy this lengthier format, please do let us know in the comments and we'll see if we can do more of them in the future. And of course, if you did enjoy the video, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Nate Dogg, Stephen, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.